Even in the darkest soil, the most beautiful stories can bloom. Witness the triumph of the human spirit over adversity in our latest collection of cinematic and emotional narratives. Subscribe today to watch beauty emerge from the shadows of life.
The morning my mother-in-law called to congratulate my husband on finally handling the storage unit situation, I was standing in the break room at work, pouring my second cup of coffee. I didn't understand what she meant. My husband and I didn't have a storage unit situation. What we had was a climate-controlled unit on the east side of town, registered in my name, holding $47,000 worth of antique furniture that I had inherited from my grandmother. I set the coffee down and called him immediately. He didn't answer. Let me back up, because this story doesn't start with a phone call. It starts about 6 years ago, when I was 31 and newly married, and genuinely believed that blending two families meant something warm and reciprocal. My husband, I'll just call him my husband, because that's what he was, and that word carries everything I needed to carry, came from a loud, tight-knit family that had very specific ideas about how money worked inside a marriage. His mother kept the books for the family construction business. His father believed that separate bank accounts were a form of emotional withdrawal. His sister once told me, at a birthday dinner for his nephew, that women who kept their own savings were planning their exit. She said it with a smile. Everyone laughed. I smiled too and reached for my wine. I had grown up differently. My grandmother, her name was June, and she was the kind of woman who ironed her pillowcases and kept a savings account her husband didn't know about, not out of deception but out of hard-won wisdom. Had spent 40 years collecting furniture. Not casually. Deliberately. She had an eye for Federal period pieces, for Chippendale chairs, for the kind of mahogany sideboard that makes auction house people sit up straighter. When she passed, 3 years before I got married, she left the collection to me. Just me. The will was specific. The pieces were appraised at $47,200. I didn't sell any of it. I rented a climate-controlled unit, paid the monthly fee out of my own account, and kept every piece wrapped and catalogued. Partly because I wasn't ready to let her go. Partly because I knew the collection would only appreciate, and partly, if I'm being honest, because some part of me understood, even then, that I needed something that was entirely mine. My husband knew about the furniture. He'd helped me move it in. He thought it was a lot of money tied up in old chairs. But he'd never pushed me to sell. Not directly. His mother was a different story. She brought it up the first Christmas. She brought it up again when we were trying to decide whether to buy a second car. She brought it up every time money felt tight, which wasn't often because I had a good job. I'm a hospital billing manager, have been for 12 years, but which felt often because her son had expensive taste and a flexible relationship with budgets. She never said sell the furniture exactly. She would say things like, well, you do have those assets sitting idle, or your grandmother would have wanted you to invest in your family, wouldn't she? Once she said, I just think it's interesting what people choose to protect. I learned to let it pass over me. I became very good at nodding and changing the subject. My husband called it keeping the peace. I called it survival, but I didn't say that out loud. The marriage wasn't bad in a dramatic way. That's the part nobody tells you about this kind of situation. There's no single moment where you can point and say, there, that's where it went wrong. It was more like a slow leak. He made decisions without consulting me and framed it as efficiency. He told his mother things I'd said in private and called it being close to his family. He questioned my purchases and never examined his own. When I got a significant raise 2 years into our marriage, his first response was to suggest we refinance the house now that we have more to work with. The raise was mine. He said, we. I'm not saying he was a monster. I'm saying he was a man who had been taught that a wife's resources were family resources and a husband's resources were his own, and he had never once been asked to examine that. I started keeping a journal. I'd write in it late at night after he was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with the light over the stove on, because I didn't want to wake him. I wrote about small things mostly. The dinner where his sister criticized how I decorated the living room and he'd said nothing. The weekend his brother needed alone and my husband offered it without asking me. The Sunday afternoon I came home from visiting a friend to find his mother had rearranged our pantry to help out. I also wrote sometimes about the furniture. About my grandmother. About the way her house had smelled like cedar and lemon oil. About how she used to tell me that a woman's independence wasn't selfishness, it was survival. I think I needed to remember that she'd said it. About 18 months ago, I noticed my husband had been on his phone more than usual. Not in an obvious way, in the way where someone is slightly too casual, where they laugh a little too quickly when you walk into the room and they're typing. I didn't say anything. I filed it away. Then, 4 months ago, the storage unit sent an automated email confirming a transfer of access authorization. I almost missed it. It came in on a Tuesday morning while I was commuting, and I read it on my phone on the train and then read it again because I thought I'd misunderstood. The unit was in my name. I had never authorized a transfer of anything. I called the facility. The woman who answered was very professional and very apologetic, and explained that a man had come in with documentation authorizing him to act on my behalf. He had signed papers. He had keys, my keys, from our house. The documentation had my signature on it. I had not signed any documentation. I want to describe how I felt in that moment, but I'm not sure I have the right words for it. It wasn't panic exactly. It was something colder. A kind of absolute clarity, like when your vision adjusts in a dark room and you can suddenly see all the furniture and you realize nothing is where you thought it was. I did not call my husband. I called a lawyer. Her name is Ms. Voss. I'd found her 2 years earlier, actually, after a coworker mentioned going through a difficult property dispute and coming out the other side intact. I'd made an appointment back then, not because I thought I needed one, but because my grandmother's voice was in my head telling me to know my options. Ms. Voss was sharp and methodical and did not waste words. I had updated her on my situation a few times over the years, including the full details of my grandmother's collection and how it was stored and registered. When I called her that Tuesday on the train, she asked me 3 questions. Had anything been removed from the unit? Did I have the original deed documents for the collection? And had I already talked to my husband? I answered, I didn't know yet, yes and no. She told me not yet. I went to the storage facility directly from work that afternoon. The manager walked me through everything. Someone, and we both understood who, had come in 5 days earlier with a notarized letter of authorization bearing my signature, and had cleared out 14 of the pieces. The most valuable ones: a federal card table, 2 Hebel side chairs, a secretary desk with the original brass hardware, combined appraised value, approximately $31,000. The manager was kind. He made copies of everything for me. He told me quietly that something about the visit had felt off to him, but the documentation had looked real and he hadn't felt he had grounds to refuse. I thanked him. I drove home. I made dinner. My husband came home and told me about his day, and I listened and asked questions and passed him the salad dressing and did not say a single word about any of it. I want to be clear that this was not passive. I was not being weak or in denial. I was doing exactly what Ms. Voss had told me to do, which was give her 72 hours to file the appropriate documents before I said anything to anyone. We had discussed this possibility, not this specific scenario, but the shape of it, and she had a plan. The documentation, it turned out, was a forgery. My signature had been traced. The notarization stamp was from a notary in another county whose license had lapsed 18 months earlier. Ms. Voss's office identified all of this within 48 hours. She filed reports with the county sheriff and with the state attorney general's fraud division. She also contacted the buyer. My husband had sold the pieces privately through an antique dealer he'd apparently been in contact with for several weeks, and informed them that the sale was fraudulent and the pieces were legally mine. The buyer's attorney called the antique dealer. The antique dealer called my husband. My husband called me twice while I was in a meeting at work. I let it go to voicemail. That evening, his mother had planned a family dinner. She had been planning it for a month. It was his parents' anniversary, and she'd booked a private room at a restaurant downtown, the kind of place with cloth napkins and a pricey menu. I had been dreading it for weeks in the ordinary way I always dreaded these gatherings. Now I was dreading it differently. I wore the gray dress my grandmother had given me for my birthday the year before she died. I don't know why exactly. It just felt right. Dinner was pleasant for exactly 40 minutes. His mother talked about the anniversary trip she and his father were planning. His sister showed photos of her kids' school play. His father told a story about a job site I'd heard before but laughed at anyway. My husband was quieter than usual. I could see him watching me across the table, trying to read something in my face. And then his phone buzzed. He looked at it under the table, the way people do when they think no one notices. His expression changed. He excused himself. He was gone for 11 minutes. I know because I timed it. sitting there eating my salmon and making conversation about whether the restaurant had good desserts. When he came back, he sat down and looked at me and said very quietly, so the table couldn't quite hear, "We need to talk." I said, "Okay." He said, "There's a problem with the storage unit." I looked at him. I kept my face very still. I said, "What do you mean?" He couldn't say it out loud. He kept starting sentences and abandoning them. His mother was watching us with narrowed eyes. His father had stopped eating. His sister was checking her phone with the determined focus of someone who knows something is happening and has decided not to know it. Finally, his mother leaned forward and said, "Is something going on?" And my husband, and this is the moment I have replayed more than any other, my husband looked at his mother and said, "I may have made a mistake with the furniture." His mother looked at me, then back at him. Then she said very evenly, "What furniture? Her grandmother's collection?" There was a long silence. Then his mother said, "The storage unit?" And he nodded. And she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as contemptuous surprise, like she was annoyed that something she'd considered a minor housekeeping matter had become a problem. And she said, "I'm sure this is something you two can sort out privately." I set down my fork. I looked at her, and I said, very pleasantly, "I don't think we'll be sorting it out privately, actually. The sheriff's department is sorting it out, and the state attorney general's fraud division, and the antique dealer has already been contacted, and the buyer's attorney filed an emergency injunction this afternoon to freeze the sale pending investigation." The table went absolutely silent. My husband's face went a color I don't have a name for. His mother opened her mouth and closed it. His father said, "What?" I picked my fork back up. The salmon was excellent. The investigation took 4 months. The forged documents were matched to my husband's handwriting on the notarized portions. The lax notary had a connection to his family's construction business. They'd used him for contracts years earlier, apparently enough of a relationship that certain favors were extended without much examination. The 14 pieces were recovered. The antique dealer cooperated fully once it became clear what had happened. He had no interest in being attached to a fraud case and returned everything. My husband was charged with 1 count of forgery and 1 count of fraud. His attorney negotiated it down eventually, but there is a record. There is a permanent, searchable public record. I filed for divorce the week the charges were filed. Ms. Voss handled that too. I want to tell you that the divorce was clean and simple, and that I felt relieved from the moment I signed the papers. That would be a tidier ending. The truth is, it was complicated and painful in ways that had nothing to do with the fraud case, and everything to do with the 6 years I had spent slowly learning to make myself smaller inside that marriage. Grief doesn't care whether someone deserves it. You mourn what you thought something was going to be. But the furniture's back in the storage unit, all 14 pieces. I went on a Sunday, about 6 weeks after the recovery, and I unlocked the unit and just stood there for a while in the cold and the dark, looking at everything wrapped in its moving blankets. My grandmother's secretary desk was right in the front. The brass hardware was intact. I sat on the floor next to it for probably 20 minutes. I didn't cry. I just sat there and thought about her house and her lemon oil and her savings account and all the quiet, persistent ways she had tried to teach me what I needed to know. I thought about how she'd have something dry and precise to say about all of this, something that would make me laugh. I'm not in a hurry to sell the collection now. I have a good job. I have a good lawyer. I have a small apartment on the north side of the city that is entirely mine, decorated exactly the way I want it, with no one rearranging the pantry and no one asking me when I'm going to do something useful with my assets. I have been told, by people who mean well, that I should be angrier, that I should feel more triumphant. What I actually feel is something quieter than either of those things. I feel like I can breathe in a way I had forgotten was possible. I feel like the person my grandmother raised me to be, who had gotten a little lost somewhere around year 3 of a marriage that required me to be someone smaller and more accommodating, has found her way back. My grandmother used to say that you should always know the value of what you own. She was talking about the furniture. She was talking about everything. I've thought a lot about what made this whole thing possible. Not the forgery. That part is straightforward. Just a man who had learned that wanting something was the same as being entitled to it. What I mean is what made it possible for things to go this far in the first place. The honest answer is that I let myself be trained, slowly and without drama, to treat my own judgment as suspect, not because anyone forced me. Because I was tired. Because keeping the peace felt, for a long time, like the more mature choice. because I had watched my husband's mother speak with total confidence about things she was completely wrong about, and I had learned to absorb that rather than push back, and somewhere in that process I had started to absorb a little too much. My grandmother, June, never did that. She was the most quietly stubborn person I have ever known. She didn't argue, she didn't perform, she just kept doing what she'd decided was right, maintaining her own account, keeping her own records, knowing the value of her own things. With a steadiness that I understand better now than I did when she was alive, she had seen enough of life to know that the people who love you can also be the people who diminish you, and that you don't have to choose between loving them back and protecting yourself. You can do both, you just have to be honest about which one you've been skipping. What I know now, that I wish I'd understood at 31, clarity is not cruelty. Knowing what you own and insisting that it remain yours is not selfishness. Naming a problem plainly is not an attack. I spent years softening every observation I had about my marriage, because I didn't want to be the difficult one, and all that softening cost me, not the furniture. The furniture came back, but time. Years of Sundays where I dreaded walking into a room, years of journal entries written by lamplight at the kitchen table because I couldn't say the things out loud. There's something I keep coming back to. My husband didn't forge those documents because he was evil in some cinematic way. He did it because he had spent his whole life in an environment where his desires were treated as logic, and somewhere he had decided that my refusal to agree with him was the irrational position. That's not a character flaw you can love someone out of. That's a worldview, and a worldview doesn't change because you're patient with it. The investigator, the fraud charges, the frozen sale, none of that was revenge. That was just what happens when actions have weight and the world is still, sometimes, constructed in a way that acknowledges that. What I had done was prepare, quietly, over years, with a good lawyer and clear documentation and the particular kind of stubbornness my grandmother had modeled for me, without ever using the word stubbornness. I think the thing I most want to say, the thing that feels truest when I sit with all of it, is that intelligence without courage doesn't protect you. I had understood for years what was happening in my marriage. I had named it in journals no one read. Understanding is not enough. At some point you have to act on what you know, and acting requires accepting that the peace you've been keeping was never really peace to begin with. The secretary desk with the brass hardware is still in the storage unit. I go see it sometimes. It doesn't need to be anything other than what it is, something valuable, carefully kept, belonging entirely to me. That's enough.